Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome an amazing and respected leader working for Mother Earth, a fellow member of the YPO from London, UK, Mr. Robert Gardner. Robert, welcome to the show.
Ash, thank you for having me on. I've only just discovered your podcast, but great to be on. Thank you.
Thank you. Robert is the Chief Executive Officer and co-founder of Rebalance Earth, which is an organization that is combining nature and finance to protect and restore nature at scale. And as I mentioned, he is a fellow member of the YPO. So Robert, my first question, tell me about your journey from co-founding Redington and Mallow Street to starting Rebalance Earth, and what was the inspiration?
Yeah, before I kind of give you the story, let me just share three philosophies I have, which I've formed over the last sort of 25 years, which is one, money as a force for good. How we spend and use our money, I think, can be used in a purposeful way. The second thing is business is a force for good. I founded a company called Redington. I founded a company, Mallow Street, where I am now. Both of those businesses are part of the B Corp movement. And Rebalance Earth, which is the third company I founded, will become a B Corp when we're eligible and we can apply. So I think business can be a force for good. And then the third thing is I believe financial markets can be a force for good. So if you think about all of the listed companies, all of the private companies, how can we bring together that? So fundamentally, I think capitalism is neither good nor bad. It's just had the wrong inputs. And I want to fundamentally rewire systems change that to create a world worth living in. And so I'm very lucky. I've had 25 years in finance, but look, it goes all the way back to, like every story, to when I was born. I was born in Holland, and technically I was born below sea level. My mum and dad, they're retired now, but they were both teachers, and they taught all over the world, and we traveled with them and lived in Argentina, saw some of the most amazing glaciers, and it inspired me to study geography at university, and I specialized in glaciology and hydrology, and was part of what's called the Alpine Glacier Project. Finished university, and then I started at Deutsche Bank. I wanted to go and earn money, like any young man or woman. I wanted to get out into the world, an amazing experience. I then worked at Merrill Lynch, and then 18 years ago, I left and founded Redington, my first business, a pensions consultancy. A few years later, founded Mallow Street, also in the pension space. I joined the board of the largest wealth manager in the UK, and I was the youngest executive director in the FTSE 100, managing over 150 billion pounds worth of assets. And the aha moment for me was really COP26 in Glasgow, which is the big climate change convention. And I was there to talk about the work that we've been doing around net zero and decarbonisation. And suddenly a stat hit me in the face. I'd seen it before, but I'd not registered it. And it's a WWF stat, which says that since 1970, we've lost 70% of our wildlife, our bees, our worms, our giraffes, our sharks, pick your favorite, a massive decline. And just for your listeners, I want you to imagine briefly that you had to go back to work tomorrow and 70% of your team had disappeared. Would you be able to deliver your product, your service to your clients? No, but this is what we've done. We've depleted the world's resources in the name of economic growth and prosperity. And I'd heard this term called rewilding, and I became fascinated with this idea of, like, how do we put the price and value of an elephant, of a whale, of water, all of these things that are intrinsically valuable to society and our economy, which we don't value by definition because we pollute them, we waste them, we destroy them. And so at the heart of it, I was like, how can I connect finance and nature? And so I'm very lucky that I have this sort of Venn diagram of someone who grew up passionate about the environment, passionate about nature, passionate about geography, and how the physical landscape exists with the social landscape. I've then had 25 years in finance, in investment banking, as a pension consultant, as one of the largest asset owners in the UK, and now as a fund manager. And I wanted to, I'm 45, I have two girls. I wanted to not look back 10 years from now, 15 years from now and say, did I do everything I could to stop the trajectory we're on when it comes to climate change and the degradation of nature that we're doing? And ultimately, everything that I do is inspired by this very simple expression: how do we create a world worth living in?
Incredible. Thank you. That was such an amazing life journey, and what an amazing motivation. And I've often said I'm from the boomers generation, and I said young people like you are really going to correct all the mistakes my generation has made in the past. Thank you. So, Robert, let's talk now about Rebalance Earth. How do you define the mission and the vision of Rebalance Earth? Because you're wanting to find a balance between money and nature.
Yeah, so it starts with that the big purpose beyond money is how do we create a world worth living in, and the way we do that is by connecting finance and nature, and how do we make nature into an asset class? So we think nature is the most valuable asset class on the planet. Economists such as Costanza have valued the ecosystem services of nature at over $140 trillion. That's about 1.5 times global GDP. But we don't value it the same way that we value our Microsoft shares or our Nvidia shares or our home in London or wherever we live in the world. So we live in a mental model where we have these things called assets, shares in a company, property, infrastructure, and then we have these other things that provide valuable ecosystem services that we don't value at all. So our big idea is that nature is business critical infrastructure that can help provide a thriving economy, one that is resilient to climate change, one that provides prosperity for everyone. And so in order to do that, we need to reframe in people's mind that nature is an asset class. And in order to do that, we need to step back and go, what makes an asset class? So I think an asset class is made up of one or more of the following 3 characteristics. Utility, i.e. I can live in a house. If I own shares in a company, Microsoft makes software, or I might own a car company, Tesla, that makes cars. Second of all, does it create a cash flow? If I own property, I can rent it out on Airbnb. If I own shares in a company, I get dividends. Thirdly, scarcity. We know that, if we own property in the right place, its scarcity can make it very valuable. We know that with certain brands, they use scarcity to drive up the price of Chanel or Rolex. Let's apply that lens to nature. Utility, of course, the air we breathe, the water we drink, the soil that's needed to feed us, every bit of wildlife that grows, that we derive medicines and cosmetics and everything else. So does it have utility? 100%. Second of all, does it generate cash flow? Kind of. We generate cash flow from agriculture. We generate cash flow from extracting minerals from the ground. And we're starting to try and put a price on carbon, but it's very nascent. And then the third thing, is it scarce? Well, I just told you we've lost 70% of wildlife. In the UK, we've lost 90% of our seagrass that sits around the coast of the UK. And here's the frightening stat. It's a UK stat. But in the UK, if we lost the humble bumblebee and other pollinating insects, it would cost us £1.8 billion a year to replace the pollinating services that those pollinators do. And that's just in the UK, a tiny country. Just imagine the impact of that across the world. So our big kind of mind shift is nature is as valuable as building a road or an airport. We know how to value those things. Let's value nature. And if we can do that, all of a sudden we can drive money and finance into nature. And then how do we create cash flow? Well, we all subscribe to stuff, and we've got this concept now called, software as a service. We're all used to paying for our Microsoft or Salesforce or Netflix on what's called a SaaS contract. And so we've said, well, why not pay for nature as a service? And we're starting with our concept in the UK, but ultimately we want to start small and then expand. But we say, what are the 5 biggest problems that companies and cities and communities face in the UK when it comes to climate change and nature loss?
Right.
Flooding, drought, water quality,
Mm.
biodiversity loss, and carbon.
Correct.
And so what if we could restore nature to reduce those risks? What if we could invest in nature to make Manchester a more resilient city, or make Bristol a more resilient city? And the companies and cities and communities that benefit from those services pay nature. And here's the cool thing, is that we can use the pension fund industry to provide the capital, because pension funds already invest in private equity and infrastructure. And so what if we can convince the pension fund industry to invest 2% in nature? So that there's a lot to unpack in that, but that is how Rebalance Earth sets aside the big goal of a world worth living in. But if we step down, it's like, how do we connect finance and nature and make it an investable asset class?
I just love what you said, nature as a service, and I'm sure there would be valuations created on each of the segments that we can think about. But how will you assess the impact of the climate change and biodiversity loss? And how would one value something, as major and yet as amorphous, if I can use that term, as this?
Yeah, look, I mean, like everything in finance, you need to start with a baseline assessment of where you are, and you need to demonstrate additionality. So have we reduced the flood risk? Have we increased the water table? Have we cleaned the water? Is the land sequestering more CO2? Is there more biodiversity? Some of those metrics are easier to measure. So water quality and water quantity are much easier to measure than biodiversity. But the most important thing is we establish a baseline from which we can measure the additional impact of what we're doing. The sad thing is that Britain is one of the most biodiverse, depleted countries on the planet. The Natural History Museum has done an assessment of biodiversity intactness across the planet, and the UK is kind of in the bottom of all countries in the world. So we start from a low baseline, so the additionality is easy to measure. What we do is that our starting point, by the way, in order to get companies to pay for nature, is not to start with the nature, but is to start with those who pay. So we identify high value catchments. So in the UK, Manchester is probably the second biggest city conurbation outside of London, 3 million people, major contributor to the UK economy, multiple smaller towns and cities around it. So that's a high value catchment. The mayor of Manchester, Andy Burnham, wants Manchester to be resilient to climate change and net zero by 2038. Now, we can't change the problem of global climate change, but we can mitigate its impact at a local level. And in the UK, we have straightened our rivers. 90% of our rivers aren't in what's called dynamic equilibrium. So we straightened them.
I see.
We stripped our soil and land of life, of soil carbon, of water retention. We've removed our hedgerows. If you go to our green and pleasant land, you can't see a bird. You can't hear any animals. It's crazy. And what we're able to do is show that by re-wiggling the river restoration, by restoring peatland, by working with farmers to use less pesticides, use less fertilizers, we can improve the soil carbon, we can store more water. And when we aggregate all of this up, we can significantly reduce the impact of flooding, which we can't change the increase in precipitation. That's a function of global climate change, but we can change the response of the local landscape to these things. And what we can do is ensure that in winter, there's less flooding, and in summer, there's more water, and we can ensure it's cleaner and available. And the cool thing is, when we do all of that, we naturally restore biodiversity. So when you restore a river, you get pools and riffles, you get the insects back, you get the birds, you get the fish. So your biodiversity increases, and you can measure that using what's called mean species abundance. And when the soil is healthy, and when you have all of these things, the land starts to sequester CO2 rather than release it. So we can measure all of these things. And I say that Rebalance Earth is like a Venn diagram of four things. It's nature, it's finance, it's community, it's people, cities and communities, and it's technology. and we can use ever-increasing sophisticated technology, satellite data, artificial intelligence, as well as on-the-ground data to measure all of those improvements in nature. And we have to do that in order to be able to charge the companies for nature as a service.
Great response. But the other aspect, Robert, that I wanted to check with you was that there are obviously a lot of skeptics, and you're taking on some rather established individuals and organizations. How do you overcome skepticism, and what are some of the challenges Rebalance Earth faces?
Yeah, I mean, there are many. I mean, part of it is a mindset, which is, we've always done it this way. Is it going to cost more? The second thing is, does it work? How, people normally, when we have flooding, we build more flood defenses out of concrete and cement. We love, here, certainly here in the UK, but I think in the Western world, the answer to everything is build more stuff, more steel, more concrete. We've lost the ancient wisdoms that some of our indigenous communities still know and understand. So we need to overcome the mindset shift. We need to be able to evidence that nature-based solutions can be as effective or more effective than kind of engineered solutions. And then on top of that, we need to make the economic case. We need to make the kind of return on investment case. This is incredibly time consuming. And I think is an example of the greatest sort of transformation that we need to go on as a planet. Now, like we've both had kind of corporate life before becoming entrepreneurs. One of the things that you learn when you work for a company is how do you go through organizational change. And one of the frameworks I love is called ADKAR: awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, reinforce. And so the reason, I was pleased to be invited on your podcast, the reason I'm a prolific writer on LinkedIn is I'm trying to create what's the awareness of the problem, what's the desire, what could be in place, knowledge. Did you know that, if we restore rivers, it reduces flooding? Did you know if you restore rivers, we get more insects and more fish? And then, use technology to demonstrate this is how we can do. And then the reinforcement ultimately will be in delivery of these products. I'm a big believer in exemplars and stories. And so in the same way that, when the railway was invented, the railway took off because up until then people used horse and carts. And then, in the UK, we built the first locomotive, and then we're like, oh, wow, we can use a locomotive. And then the same happened with cars at the beginning of the 19th century. Sorry, at the beginning of the 20th century. The same has happened with Steve Jobs and the mobile phone when he stood up and presented his iPhone. And so my number one priority is to create an exemplar either in the city of Plymouth or the city of Manchester to showcase all of this can work. And that's the R in ADKAR. And I think once we do that, we begin the kind of flywheel that compounds, which, as a fellow entrepreneur, someone who's scaled their business, you understand the kind of flywheel effect. But anyway, that's the plan.
But the other thing that I wanted to get your perspective on was that people have often said that during the pandemic, we left Mother Nature on her own, and she was able to bounce back all over the world. And then the pandemic ended, the human being came back to life, and we started messing around again. What are your perspectives?
No, well, I think that's exactly right. I mean, a good friend of mine who's a leading scientist on river restoration, he did a lot of work on Chernobyl, and it's amazing how after that disaster, life has come back. So the good news is that Mother Earth will be okay. Mother Earth's 4 billion years old and will carry on.
Yes.
The question is, what do we 8 billion people do and survive and thrive? The moment, we just have to stop doing the bad things. And what the pandemic did was we just stopped everything down. And, we can all share stories about where wildlife and nature came down, was in our gardens, was in our cities. You could hear the birds. So I'm not worried about Mother Earth. I'm worried about human prosperity.
Correct.
And our dependence on it, because the moment our population collapses and it falls away, nature will bounce back, no problem.
Absolutely. And what is the role of the governments and regulators when it comes to, participating or supporting all your projects?
Everyone always thinks the answer is governments need to spend more money, and if only government. And I think I think you just asked to go for more money. I have a fundamental view that the number one goal of government is to think long term and to make those decisions. It's that sort of Chinese proverb that says the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, the next time is now. I think government should be planting trees for the next generation. And that's everything from health to education and to the environment. Unfortunately, we live in a global world of politicians where the thinking is the opposite of long term. It's short term, it's populist, what gets our votes. And the sad truth is, unless we do something about climate change and nature loss, it's going to be costly for everyone. And you know what? The people who will suffer the most are the poorest people, which, is just disheartening. So I think, first of all, think long term. I think, second of all, they just need to set very clear policies, carrots, incentives, and sticks that drive the transition to a circular, green world where we tackle energy. We have abundant free energy coming from the sun every day. And we've already figured out how to tap into that. Let's think about how we farm differently. We live in a world where we've changed our diet so radically that, in the developed world, in the US and UK, people have diabetes, people are extreme levels of obesity, people have high levels of mental health. How is this a world worth living in?
Correct.
How is drinking cans of soda, not exercising, a world that we want to end up in? I want to eat food that tastes good because the soil hasn't been covered in pesticides and fertilizers, because it is healthy. And there are pockets of places around the world where we're getting it right. What we need to do, and it's back to my point that I don't think capitalism is good or bad. I think capitalism just needs the right inputs to drive the right outputs. And I think the role of government is thinking long-term and setting those policies, because I think entrepreneurs, like the people who listen on this course, business leaders, will get behind that and will build a business model that works within that system. And I think that plays into this kind of concept I said right at the beginning about financial markets as a force for good, because the response is that then businesses can be a force for good in that context.
Well said, well said. Robert, I have time for one more question. And I want to come back to finance and an area that you're working in a lot. And I know that there are people like you who are wanting to give back and use their finance knowledge. My question is, what new technologies or innovations are you excited about in the field of sustainable finance?
Yeah, I mean, the availability of satellite data, drone data, the ability to collect data at scale to make more informed, better decisions is just amazing. I just came back from the Alpine Glacier project 25 years after I did it, and we can collect more data in a day or in a week than a PhD student would have been able to collect 25 years ago. So that is exciting. I think the second thing is, if we can get the energy and the water right, is artificial intelligence, the ability to process this data at speed to lead to better insights. So AI, I think, to me, is a bit of a contradiction, because it is, I think, game changing, but it consumes an enormous amount of energy and it consumes an enormous amount of water. And I think if we can crack that, we can sort of tap into AI. I think the third thing is not really a technology, but I suppose is more knowledge, is about behavior change. How do we, at the end of the day, it starts and ends with humans, and we need to change people's behaviors. And actually, it's going back to old school storytelling, because the best way to change people's minds, behaviors, is good old fashioned storytelling.
Well said. And on that note, Robert, I just want to say thank you so much for speaking to me about your own core principles of what has guided you. Thank you for talking to me about how, as someone very young traveling around the world, watching all the glaciers. You got introduced to nature, and you're one of the few people who seem to have taken it to heart and are giving back in a much, much bigger way. Thank you for speaking to me about Rebalance Earth. I mean, I didn't have any statistic, but your 70% biodiversity loss in the last 15, 20, 30 years is quite an eye-opener. And I'm sure my viewers and listeners who are predominantly young will react to a lot of this data that you've given. Thank you for speaking to me about so many different aspects of the challenges we're facing, about the opportunities that are there for us, and about the amazing work that you are doing. Thank you also for bringing a new terminology from my own perspective, which is nature as a service. Thank you, Robert, for speaking to me. All the very best, and a grateful thank you from someone much older for all the great work you're doing for our world. Thank you again.
Well, Ash, thanks for having me on board. And I think it's amazing that you've put this podcast, because it's a great way to spread this wisdom and knowledge. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.